Welcome to Dedicated. I'm your host, Doug Brunt. Today we're talking with former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Liz Truss. Liz is an author and politician. She's been a member of Parliament since 2010 and over the years has held various positions in government, including Prime Minister in 2022. Appointed by Queen Elizabeth II and was serving as Prime Minister at the time of the Queen's death. She is out with her new book, 10 Years to Save the West, Leading the Revolution Against Globalism, Socialism, and the Liberal Establishment. Liz, it's an honor to have you with us here today. Thank you.
Great to be on your show.
Now, we're having our conversation early in the day, and you have a big day. So there's no liquor today. We're going to have a little espresso to stay on our toes.
Cheers.
All right, but to start at the beginning, you were born in Oxford, England. If you're born there, are you still as in awe of the beauty and the history of it?
Well, I only stayed there for 2 years, so I had no memory of it.
Okay.
I just know I was born there. So my dad's an academic, mathematician, so he worked at various universities, and he was working at Oxford when I was born. But then we moved to the north of England and then to Scotland. So I didn't really remember much about Oxford.
Well, I did read that your dad was a math professor, and I had a quick story on that because Douglas Murray was on the show a while ago, and he had this new book out called War on the West. And in the book, I had the advanced copy, the galley of it, and he was saying, I've got to go study maths, M-A-T-H, letter S at the end of it. And then I saw it again and again. I'm like, 2 could be a typo, 3 is a thing. So I looked it up, and British say maths. I'm like, this is crazy. And so I wrote down these notes. I'm like, I'm going to persuade him to stop doing that because it's really annoying. You can't even make your tongue do the sequence of that. So I get into the interview with Douglas Murray, and I raise it, and I'm prepared. I'm ready to debate him. And he says, oh, yeah, he was like, that was just the galley. I fixed that by the time the hardcover came out. I totally agree. And so I won without firing a shot. I feel like my debate record against Douglas Murray is 1-0. And I will never, of course, try to add to that record because I'll lose.
Well, I had to translate my book into American English just to make sure people this side of the Atlantic understood what I was trying to say.
So do you say maths?
I say math in that book.
Yeah, I saw
just
that.
So Americans understand that. The British book obviously has maths in it.
Oh, it does? Okay.
It does.
So,
it does.
Right.
There's all kinds of political terms I've had to translate. So in America, you say squishy when you're talking about people on the left of the Republican Party. In Britain, we say wet. So I've had to make all those changes as well.
Oh, that's interesting. I'll have to get the other copy too, because I have lots of dog ears in here, and I was very happy to see math and not maths. So, you did return to Oxford, so Merton College in '93.
I did, yeah.
Okay. Now I read this is sort of out there, and including on Wikipedia, but you arrived in '93 as a sort of a left Democrat and abolished the monarchy. But by the time you were out of there in '96, you had changed quite a bit.
Yeah, my upbringing was very left wing. My mum was campaigning against nuclear weapons. So she's probably one of the few people in Britain who knew who Caspar Weinberger was, and was critical of Reagan, thought that the USSR and the US were morally equivalent, and just wanted Britain to get rid of all of its weapons. So that's the atmosphere I was brought up in.
Yep.
My parents are left-leaning academics, essentially. But as time went on, I began to question that. And I also began to question all the left-wingery I heard at my school. So I went to a public state school in Leeds, and there was lots of chat about racism and sexism, and I just wondered why they weren't teaching kids things like maths properly.
It's amazing
math,
to me that
you would call it.
You made the switch from left to right during those academic years. I mean, normally, Krauthammer switched and Hitchens switched, but years later, in academia, normally that's when people are firmly going
I think
left.
I was already a conservative. Even when I was 18, I was probably a conservative. I just didn't know it. And it wasn't socially acceptable to be a conservative in North Leeds. It was a very liberal place, full of people who worked in the public sector, didn't know anybody with a business background. And it was when I went to university, I studied economics, and I joined the Hayek Society, and that was probably a sign that I was on my way to the right. So, but I've always believed that people should have control over their own lives. I hated being told what to do. And it was finally at university that the penny dropped, and I thought, actually, I am a conservative.
Yeah. And then for that, you need thick skin. You've always been politically minded. And there's sort of a pugilistic nature to being able to thrive in that, and also a thick skin. Did you naturally have a thick skin, or have you developed it, or is there more developing yet to go? I mean, we're all human after all.
I think everyone says I'm tough, and even my mum, when I was little, used to say I was tough. So maybe I have always had a thick skin, but I'm also idealist as well. So I tend not to. I'm just not cynical about the world. However much I feel sometimes let down by various people and things not happening, I am an optimist about the future. So I think that is what propels me as much as being thick-skinned.
Well, you identify in the book a couple of the nicknames that you acquired early on in politics, like the human hand grenade and Little Miss Dynamite and things like that. And I had to say, over the years, having been with my wife for many years, I have observed things that, like, smart, successful, attractive woman. Those are 4 things. You're really allowed to be a maximum of 2. If you're 3, it can be a problem. And if you're 4, if you're all 4, like you or my wife, some people just lose their minds.
I think there's an element of truth to that. And I think that these things are always interpreted, aren't they? I'm an ambitious person. I see nothing wrong with being ambitious, but in Britain, ambition has become a dirty word. That is somehow something to be ashamed of. You've got to look like you're not trying. You've got to look like you don't care. And I think that's a problem with our culture. And we do have tall poppy syndrome. So people love to take pot shots at people who are doing well, people who are successful. And I think it's one of the things I admire about America is I do think there is more of a culture of admiring success rather than thinking that's something to be resented.
No, that's interesting. Douglas Murray said the same thing here. I think I said, what's one of the biggest differences between the UK and the US? And he said the way that Americans celebrate their fellow Americans' successes happens more here than there. That's interesting that you both say the same thing. But focusing on the woman,
I kind of feel like that some of the best, some of the best. So in my book, I say that the US was Britain's greatest invention. And
which we bristle at that.
You kind of bristle, and I say it was accidental and so on. And obviously we tried to burn down the White House, etc. But I do feel some of the great elements of Britain almost left across the Atlantic because they were frustrated with the culture of Britain. So it was the people with the get up and go and the optimism and the success culture.
Yeah, that's true.
Were some of the founders of America. And in fact, Thomas Paine, who was one of the thinkers behind the American Revolution, was actually born in my constituency in Norfolk. So I feel that it is there in Britain, but unfortunately there's also a lot of tall poppy syndrome, anti-success as well. Yeah.
Well, that sort of more rigid class societal system over there is less so here, a little bit more fluid going up and down the ladder here. But to focus on the women thing for a second, here we're about to hit our 250th birthday as a nation. No female president. You in the UK have managed that already. You personally. So why are we lagging behind that here, do you think?
It's hard to say, and people always ask me what it's like to be a woman in politics, and I say, well, I've got no comparator. I don't know what it's like to be a man in politics. I don't know how it feels, and there are benefits to being a woman in politics. You're more visible. It's when you say things, they actually get more attention, I think, than when and you can use that to your advantage. I mean, in the US. I don't know, but I think if the right woman came along,
maybe
they could succeed.
Maybe the premise of the question is off. I mean, I don't think you've done it, but it's not any easier over there. It's just you've happened to do it.
I mean, Mrs. Thatcher was an absolutely unique force of nature and person, and the 70s were such a interesting time for Britain because we were on the rocks. We were on the rocks. We had to go for a bailout to the IMF. And she was somebody who stepped up. And it was almost because, she was from a middle-class background. She was a woman. she didn't accept the orthodoxy of the sort of patronising paternalist elite of Britain who just thought the country was in decline. I mean, that's still our problem, is we've got a bunch of people in Britain who think our best days are behind us. They want to preserve the status quo. And she was anti that. And I think being a woman and being from a middle-class background was part of that. Maybe America just hasn't declined enough, and with a bit more decline, you'll then get the, because she was countercultural.
Yeah.
She was really countercultural.
I think there are times when that kind of thing is resonating here as well, when different people are getting behind certain politicians who seem to appeal to that very dynamic you're mentioning there. So while you have been in government, you have represented a number of different areas, and you go through each in the book: environment, justice, treasury, trade. Before we get on to certain topic areas, and as I mentioned, this is not that political a show. We're more of like book nerds, and we want to know the writing process and things like that. So I want to talk a bit about your process, not just with writing, but how you sort of organize your thoughts as you approach speeches and debates and books. For speeches, I imagine you give a ton, and do you also work with speech writers from time to time then to do some of the speeches?
I have in the past, but I do that less now because my favorite type of speaking is actually speaking from the cuff and having a sort of few points to make and then letting it off the leash. That's the way I like to speak most. Yeah. And I think a lot as I talk. So I always find reading out a written speech much harder than speaking from points. I hate teleprompters. Yeah. I've tried to use teleprompters loads of times. It's never really worked for me because the best way I communicate is by speaking off the cuff.
I would be terrified that whoever's operating the teleprompter would be messing it up. Like once you're on there, you got to stay on there, and then
And there's all this thing about how you have to look to one side and look to the other side, and it's just
make it look natural.
You're basically a robot, aren't you?
Yeah.
And it's that robotic thing that I don't like. And what I find is if other people write my speeches, it's not the words I use or the way I say it, so I have to rewrite it anyway.
Yeah.
So I like to brainstorm with people and get ideas. And actually, I'm better at writing things and developing things when somebody else is in the room. And so I can't just sit there on my own for hours and hours. I need people to bounce off.
So then you rehearse it out loud, make sure it sounds natural for the spoken word.
Exactly.
How about those scenes? I love these scenes in Parliament. As Americans, we get it sometimes captured in a movie, or maybe something makes the news clips so we see the actual thing happening, but it's the tiered seating benches on the one side and on the other side, and one person gets up to this high desk, and it has the feel of an aggressive comedy roast. Everyone's trying to do a zinger on the other side, and then that person sits down, the other person gets up and goes right back in this crazy back and forth thing. How do you prepare for that? Are you trying to get a couple zingers in your back pocket for someone who's going to come at you a little bit? Yeah,
so that only really happens on Prime Minister's Questions, which only happens once a week. Most of Parliament is a lot more boring than that, so it's the exception rather than the rule. But you do have to spend a lot of time preparing because you could be asked a question on any topic. So you have a massive file of everything from energy to education to health to wokery, in a massive file. But you kind of know what are the top 2 or 3 topics you might get hit on that week.
And you have
to be ready. Well, you know that it's the leader of the opposition is the person who's going to be having a go at you. And
you have to do this every week?
Yeah.
Oh, my God.
I mean, by the way, I think it's a problem in British politics that the Prime Minister's time is used up on that.
Yeah, it's very
it's great fun.
Too.
And it's great fun for the watching audience, but this is somebody who's a G7 leader spending half a day at least a week preparing for a Punch and Judy show. Is that a good use of their time? I mean, it's great.
And that's tradition going back how long?
Well, it goes back many, many years, but it used to be the case the Prime Minister would sit there with other ministers as well, and they would also answer the questions. But Mrs. Thatcher, back to her, decided she was going to answer all the questions herself. And she used to do it twice a week.
Oh, my gosh.
So she was so I mean, she was such a workaholic.
Yeah.
She was determined to answer everything. So she created this rod for the back of future prime ministers of knowing everything about everything.
I guess it keeps you sharp. My gosh, that is a lot of work and a lot of stress, I would think.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's stressful. It is enjoyable as well because, when you're there, you feel this is where it's at. There really is nothing tougher.
And
than being in that bear pit.
The BBC airs it, or where does it show up?
Yeah, it's on the BBC, but it gets reported on every news station in the UK.
Okay.
And there's lots of different shows commentating on it. It's like a sports event. It's like politics as a sports event.
Yeah. I mean, it does seem gladiatorial. It's just like very, very aggressive out there. But how about the differences in terms of how you approach either a book or a speech or a debate? I mean, how was your process for writing this book?
So what I did is I, first of all, sort of came up with a structure and chatted it through with people. I then talked through it and recorded it, wrote it up, and then went through changing it. So that was the process. But it took quite a lot of, because what I was trying to do is I went very quickly through my career. Like I covered a hell of a lot of departments and got to the top.
Yeah.
Essentially within 12 years, 2010 to 2022. So it was a roller coaster, and I was, always thinking like, how do I deal with this job? What are the issues there? So after I left office, after I'd been deposed as Prime Minister, I then had time to think about how do all these things fit together? What were the common threads? Why were some things successful, other things not successful? What were the issues I faced? So I tried to pull it together in retrospect.
So let's talk on some of those topic areas that you did serve in government at different posts. To start, justice. I had a question because you had some really fascinating stats about justice in the book regarding incarceration. And so considering a population of 100,000, comparing the U.S. to the U.K., in the U.K., out of 100,000, 144 would be incarcerated. In the U.S., it's 755. Why is it so much higher here, do you think?
Well, there's higher crime here, and you put more people in jail for crimes. I mean, I think we should build more prisons in the UK. I think we don't put enough people in jail, and we don't keep them in long enough for serious crimes. And, we're now in a position where our jails are full and criminals are having to be released early, which is a massive problem.
Well, that's happening here too. I think someone looked at these numbers and said 755, that needs to be lower. And then we'll just let out, a whole bunch. And that is so backward because it almost seems to incentivize crime. People steal $500
The problem
from the
isn't
CVS,
the prison
like,
places. The problem is people are committing the crimes. And why are they committing crimes in the first place? That's the problem.
That needs to be addressed.
And the whole justice system in Britain is far too focused on the back end of the problem of what do you do with the criminals rather than the front end of the problem of how do you stop people committing crime in the first place.
Yeah. This is something that Bill Bratton, former commissioner in New York and also L.A., and I think at one point, whoever was prime minister at the time tried to have him come over and
I remember. It could have been
London.
Boris Johnson, actually, I think.
Might have been Boris Johnson, yeah. But he's terrific, the whole broken windows theory of preventing the crime before it happens.
It's absolutely right, but it's always unfortunately, the system is always biased towards fixing problems after they happen. Because it's very hard to justify money for prevention when people are calling out for urgent action to sort out a problem now. That's always the problem. It's true with health. It's true with crime. It's true on...
Which nation around the world is doing it well? Is there a model to look to?
Well, on criminal justice, I think countries like Japan are very effective at dealing with it. And they do have a lot of, frankly, societal constraints. It's back to the broken windows theory. If you allow minor transgressions, if you allow serious misbehavior, if antisocial behavior is accepted, then people go to the next level. Yeah.
You got to create the
environment. And having a strong society, strong families, a culture that frowns on that type of behavior is the way to prevent crime. That's the bottom line. And I think the problem with Britain and America, and I say this from a British perspective, is government has got too big. It's taken on responsibility that should be the responsibility of families. Things like disciplining and educating children. There's too much interference from the state. And the result of that is you end up with people who haven't had that discipline and that culture from an early age. And therefore, you need to take much stronger action when they're older.
Yeah.
And we've got a big problem with discipline in our schools. And people, children abusing teachers. And where there's been an overall move away from the idea that adults in the school have authority. And this is part of, I think, the overall leftist attack on traditional culture. So the criminal justice system is basically sorting out problems society has created.
Right.
And you need to actually fix the society rather than... if people are in prison, you're very late down the road.
Yeah, I think that's right. A bit on woke culture. You talk in the book about how America exported woke in the wake of
if only
George
we'd
Floyd.
cut off the transatlantic cables to stop this nonsense coming into the
Keep it over
UK.
here.
It's true though. I mean, so much of the woke nonsense, this idea there are 100 genders, was started. In American universities, it started in American society, and I was astounded when I became Equality Minister back in 2019 or 2020 that this stuff had become so endemic in our public services. I had no idea when I was first elected in 2010 we'd be talking about what a woman was. There's no question of that.
Yeah, and in the UK, I think you've passed some recent laws around the puberty blockers. And here, so science has emerged to say these are harmful. There's long-term problems.
You might say that was pretty obvious.
Yeah, but
that if you try and block puberty, it probably isn't a good idea.
Well, you guys have passed laws against it. Here, I think 22 states have, but 28 haven't. And the Biden administration is really fully supporting puberty blockers going forward still. How are you guys better on that than we are in terms of, looking at the science?
Well, there has been a big backlash in Britain. I mean, JK Rowling, the Harry Potter author, has
fearless about it.
Been absolutely fearless about this. And a number of very brave people in the public services have blown the whistle on what was going on, which is children were being given drugs that essentially rendered them unable to have their own children, damage their bodies, and there is no support for these drugs to be taken amongst the general public. So I'm very pleased that we do have a conservative government in Britain. I think that makes a difference. I wish the government had done more, but we have now acted. We've had a review showing these blockers are damaging, and we are stopping them being taken by young people. I don't. It's very hard for me to understand how anybody can think this is a good idea.
Yeah.
And why the public aren't completely up in arms about what amounts to the abuse of children. Yeah. And what we have some very extremist gender ideologues who are directly trying to influence children, often online, to take things that are damaging for their future. So
you talk in the book about a lack of courage of some people in office, and one of the reasons for that you suggest is that many people in office know when they're out of office, they're going to need to make some money. And so while they're in office, they're afraid to ruffle feathers or sort of anger the wokish mob. And I remember it reminded me of this book I was reading, talking about Lord Salisbury, the revered PM around the turn of the pre-World War I, sort of the last years of Queen Victoria. And he had this idea that, it's the rich are, one good thing about having the rich govern is they're not in it for the money because they're already rich. So,
I'm actually reading that. Is it the Andrew Roberts book on Lord Salisbury? Because I'm reading that at the moment.
No, this is a Massey book from a long time ago.
I don't think that we can have government just of people who are rich, who don't.
Right. Yeah.
And so we do need to pay politicians, which is one of the points I made in the book. But I think the democratic accountability is very important. In Britain, too many decisions have been outsourced to unelected bodies. And the problem is that unelected bodies are much easier to capture by these leftist woke activists than democratically elected politicians are, because ultimately I know that if I don't do what the people of South West Norfolk want, I will be booted out of the next election. Whereas if you are head of the National Health Service, or you're head of a health quango, or you're head of the central bank, you are much more beholden to the sort of influences in the London circuit or the Washington, D.C. circuit. So I do think elected representatives are better connected with the public than those who are unelected and unaccountable. And what we've seen, I mean, look at what Stonewall has done. You know, they have basically said to people, big corporations, if you don't sign up for our Stonewall Charter, you know, you are anti-gay people. And the problem is that those corporate executives have kowtowed to that for fear of seeming, you know, homophobic or sexist or anti the environment. They've signed up to all these edicts, and it's got more and more extreme. And now it's, you know, unless you sign up to having unisex restrooms and children having puberty bloggers, you're homophobic.
Yeah. I want to pick up on your comments about the elections and talk about the election process for a second. Over where you are, you have the leadership contest, that's sort of intra-party efforts. And, you know, that's our version of that is the primary process. And both are kind of fraught, and for the parties can be sort of near suicidal. Are there obvious flaws or fixes for that you see?
Well, I think there's a big debate at the moment about the future of conservatism, certainly in the UK, and the future of the Republican Party in the US. What do we stand for? And I would say the debate in Britain is between people who think the institutions have moved to the left and we need to go along with that. We need to be the party of the status quo. The status quo has changed. Therefore, we need to adopt some of these postures on climate change or wokery. Whereas there are others, of which camp I'm in, who say the left have taken over these institutions and we actually need to fight back. And that is what I think is going on in the leadership elections in the UK, but also the primary process in the US, is people saying, to what extent do we take on that leftist status quo?
Yeah. Switching to the media for a second, here in the U.S., and of course, I follow the U.S. and don't know as much about the U.K. Here in the U.S., traditional media seems to be very much on the decline. There are a lot of independent journalists and media folks who have, out on their own, developed enormous platforms that are bigger than many of the shows on the networks. So there's a real fragmenting of the way U.S. consumers are getting their news. Is it the same in the UK? Are you seeing the same kind of thing?
I'd say we're behind the US, and
the BBC
I actually like what's happening in the US, because at present I feel too much of the media, the BBC being the absolute prime example, doesn't reflect the views of the public. I think they're out of touch with the views of the public. They live in a media bubble, you know, very, very anti-Trump, very, very pro-EU, pro-immigration. You know, they have a particular worldview, which is not the view of people in Britain. And I think in Britain, we are seeing new channels emerging like GB News. We're seeing independent voices emerging, but it is nowhere near as big as it's got in the United States. But I think if we look at the United States, we can see that is the future of the British media.
Okay. Last question before we get into the lightning round. When the PM finishes service in 10 Downing, it's a very regular thing to then continue in government in another role. That happens with all the PMs. Here in America, it is so weird and awkward to think about. The last president who went on to serve in Congress after serving as president was John Quincy Adams, almost exactly 200 years ago. So for us, we look at that and think, how unusual. Is it strange for you to serve as PM and then continue in other roles?
I think the best way to think about it is the Prime Minister role in Britain is a bit like a combination of the Speaker of the House of Representatives as well as the President. And when I see what's going on in US Congress at the moment, I sort of recognize the behavior because that is exactly the kind of thing that goes on in the Conservative Parliamentary Party. So you are, as an MP, you're always part of the mix. You're always a part of the decision-making process about who the leader is. And, there are always roles of backbenchers who are independent of the government, and then the government ministers, and that's the way it works. I mean, I think I'm the only former PM that is standing for election at the next election. So it's not like many people like Tony Blair and Gordon Brown stood down after they finished being Prime Minister. But I think it's important to have people who've got experience of being in the executive sitting in the legislature, which we don't have separation of powers in Britain. We have a sort of a legislative group who form the executive. So it's a very different situation. But it is more like Congress.
Okay. All right. Last section here, onto the lightning round. Your favorite book as a kid?
I love Alice in Wonderland.
Great
book.
Love that. Book or books you're reading now? And I know you're running all over the place. So
I was just telling about Lord Salisbury. I'm reading about him at the moment. I've just finished Barry Goldwater's book, With No Apologies, which I find very interesting about how the conservative movement developed in America.
Cool. I'll have to get that one. All right. Person in politics or media globally who you feel is best able to represent the conservative point of view?
So I'm a big fan of Javier Milei. And I think what he's doing in Argentina, advocating free market economics, advocating limited government, is a breath of fresh air in a world that's been moving to the left.
He is getting a lot of global news these days.
He is. What's going on there. We love the chainsaw, the way he explains it. I attended his speech at the CPAC conference, and it was like going to an economics lecture on steroids. It was fantastic.
All right, same question for the left.
I really struggle to answer that question because the new left, the sort of AOCs of this world, seem to me to be quite destructive of our way of life. And I'm much more of an admirer of the traditional left, the sort of the Tony Benns of this world who believed in the British Constitution and our way of life. So I struggle to find a figure on the left now that I have got great admiration for. Any
other names from even the 80s or 90s historically who you'd say, if we could only have that person sort of be, we'd have a constructive debate.
The trouble is, as somebody who's a conservative, if you have successful people on the left, they move the country in the wrong direction.
Right.
So I kind of want incompetent people on the left rather than competent people. So that's why I'm sort of, I can name you any number of incompetent left-wingers who I'd love to see in government because I would include Keir Starmer on that list. But the effective people on the left, such as Tony Blair or Clement Attlee, in my opinion, drove the country in the wrong direction. So I'm kind of conflicted.
It's a catch-22 there on that one. Most awkward or strange moment from your years in government?
There have been quite a lot. There was a particular moment actually here in New York when I was at the UN General Assembly, and I went to an exhibition about war crimes that were taking place in Ukraine. And I saw a blonde lady at the other side of the room, and I shouted out, "Hi, Dr. Biden," because I thought it was Jill Biden. She turned around, and it turned out to be Brigitte Macron, Emmanuel Macron's wife. Yep. And she gave me a strange look, and that was very embarrassing.
Favorite state of the American 50 states?
That is quite difficult because I've been to Utah recently and I really enjoyed that.
That's beautiful.
I love Charleston in South Carolina, and I'm quite a big fan of Texas and Texas barbecue. Yeah.
Okay, good answers. All great places. I was just reading Eric Larson's book, which is Fort Sumter, Charleston, South Carolina, is sort of the central part of the book, and it's a fascinating history there as well. Favorite place in Britain that every American should visit at some point?
I think from a sheer beauty point of view, Oxford is an amazing place to visit and a very special place for me, having been at a university there. I think Norfolk is fantastic. It has very open skies, and it's a beautiful, beautiful coastline. And I think people from the United States would be, it's got lots of history, lots of great churches, but it's also very open.
Okay, great.
People would like
it's on the list then. Last question for former Prime Minister Liz Truss. One piece of advice for the audience.
I think my piece of advice is be brave and go for it. I know I've had my fingers burnt from taking my own advice, but I think you've only got one life to live.
That's beautiful. Great. Thank you.
Thanks
for coming in.
Great pleasure.